The fluorescent lights of the emergency room hummed overhead as Margaret clutched her swollen belly, her worn cotton dress damp with sweat. A man in a white coat looked down at her trembling hands, then at the cracked leather of her shoes. He turned away. "We don't have room for people who can't pay," he said, his voice flat and cold. The waiting room fell silent. Every eye turned toward the door. Hello, friends. Welcome to our story. Before we begin, please like this video, subscribe, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Margaret was 37 weeks pregnant. 37 weeks of hope. 37 weeks of whispered prayers and quiet dreams. 37 weeks of watching her body change, of feeling life flutter and kick beneath her skin, of believing, truly believing, that after all the years of loneliness, something beautiful was finally about to begin. But now, standing in the cold fluorescent light of that emergency room, Margaret felt all of that hope slipping through her fingers like water. The baby had stopped moving. She had noticed it that morning, lying in bed with her hands resting on her belly the way she always did. She waited for the familiar nudge, the little roll, the gentle pressure of a tiny foot pushing against her ribs. But there was nothing, just stillness, just silence, just the slow, creeping weight of fear settling into her chest. She told herself it was fine. Babies rest, babies sleep. The books said so. The nurses at the free clinic said so. But deep inside, in that place where a mother knows things she cannot explain, Margaret felt something was wrong. By evening, the pain started. It came in waves, sharp, sudden cramps that made her double over and grip the edge of the kitchen counter. She tried to breathe through it. She tried to stay calm, but when she looked down and saw the faint stain of blood on her dress, calm was no longer possible. She had no car. She had no phone. She walked 3 blocks to her neighbor's house, clutching her belly, stopping every few steps to steady herself against a fence post or a mailbox. The night air was thick and humid, and the streetlights cast long shadows on the cracked sidewalk. By the time she reached the door, her face was pale and damp with sweat. Her neighbor, an elderly woman named Ruth, took one look at her and grabbed her keys. The drive to the hospital felt endless. Margaret sat in the passenger seat with her eyes closed, her lips moving in silent prayer. She thought about all the things she hadn't done yet, the crib she hadn't finished setting up, the tiny yellow onesie still folded in its plastic wrapper, the name she had chosen, but never spoken aloud to anyone but God. Hope. She had named her baby Hope. And now, speeding through the darkness toward a place she had never been, Margaret was terrified that hope was the only thing she had left. When they arrived at the hospital, Ruth helped her through the sliding glass doors and into the bright, sterile chaos of the emergency room. There were people everywhere, coughing, crying, waiting. A television mounted on the wall played the evening news, but no one was watching. Margaret walked slowly to the front desk, her hands pressed against her lower back, her breath shallow and uneven. The woman behind the counter barely looked up. Name? Margaret Hollis. Insurance? Margaret hesitated. She felt the weight of that single word pressed down on her like a stone. I don't have insurance," she said quietly. "But I'm bleeding, and my baby, she's not moving. Please, I just need someone to check on her." The woman's expression didn't change. She typed something into her computer, then glanced at a clipboard beside her. "Have a seat. Someone will call you." Margaret sat. She waited. Minutes passed. Then an hour. The cramps grew worse. The fear grew louder. She watched nurses walk past without looking at her. She watched doctors disappear behind doors she wasn't allowed to enter. She watched other patients, patients with insurance cards, patients with clean clothes and calm faces, get called back one by one, and still no one came for her. She was invisible. She was poor and tired and alone. And in that moment, those things seemed to matter more than the life growing inside her, more than the blood staining her dress, more than the desperate, silent prayer still echoing in her heart. Margaret had nothing to offer that hospital. No money, no status, no connections. She had only herself, a 41-year-old woman with cracked hands and worn shoes, sitting in a plastic chair beneath a buzzing light, holding on to the last thing she had ever truly wanted. If she didn't get help tonight, she could lose her baby. She could lose the only future she had dared to imagine. She could lose herself. And no one in that waiting room, not the nurses, not the doctors, not the woman behind the desk, seemed to notice or care. Margaret closed her eyes and placed both hands on her belly. "Stay with me," she whispered. "Please, baby, stay with me." But the silence beneath her palms gave no answer. 3 months earlier, life had been simpler, not easy. Margaret had never known easy, but simpler, quieter. The kind of life that moved slowly, like honey dripping from a spoon, where the days blended softly into one another, and the biggest worry was whether the tomatoes in the garden would ripen before the first frost. Margaret lived in a small rented cottage at the edge of Cedarville, a quiet Georgia town where everybody knew everybody and strangers were rare. The house wasn't much, just 4 rooms with creaky floors and windows that stuck in the summer heat, but it was hers. She had hung yellow curtains in the kitchen and placed a ceramic vase of wildflowers on the windowsill. She had swept the front porch every morning and sat on the steps every evening, watching the sky turn pink and gold as the sun dipped behind the pine trees. It was a peaceful life, a gentle life. And for the first time in many years, Margaret had allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she deserved it. She worked as a housekeeper at a bed and breakfast called the Wisteria Inn, a charming old Victorian house on the main road that catered to tourists passing through on their way to Savannah. The owner, a kind widow named Mrs. Bellamy, had hired Margaret 5 years ago and never once made her feel like less than family. Margaret arrived every morning at 7 before the guests came down for breakfast and spent her hours folding towels warm from the dryer, arranging fresh flowers in the guest rooms, and polishing the wooden banisters until they gleamed. She loved the rhythm of the work, the simplicity of it, the way the morning light spilled through the tall windows and made the dust motes dance in the air like tiny stars. She hummed hymns while she swept, old songs her mother used to sing, and sometimes, when no one was around, she talked to her baby. "You're going to love this world," she would whisper, smoothing a pillowcase with her worn hands. "It's got sunshine and birdsong and the smell of rain on warm pavement. It's got peach cobbler and front porch swings and people who smile at strangers. You just wait, little one. You're going to love it." The baby would kick in response, a tiny flutter beneath her ribs, and Margaret would smile so wide her cheeks ached. In the afternoons, after her shift ended, Margaret walked home along the dusty road that wound through the center of town. She passed the hardware store where old Mr. Patterson sat on a bench, whittling wooden birds. She passed the church with the tall white steeple and the bell that rang every Sunday at noon. She passed the corner where children played hopscotch on the sidewalk, their laughter rising like music into the warm afternoon air. Everyone waved, everyone smiled. And Margaret waved and smiled back, feeling, for the first time in her life, like she truly belonged somewhere. At home, she moved slowly through her evening routine. She watered the tomato plants in the backyard. She fixed herself a simple dinner, usually soup or a sandwich, and ate it at the small wooden table by the window while the last of the daylight faded. She read passages from a worn Bible that had belonged to her mother, the pages soft and thin from decades of turning. And then, as the night settled in around her, she sat in the old rocking chair in the corner of her bedroom and talked to her baby again. She told her stories, simple ones, about the birds outside her window, about the way the moon looked when it was full, about the sound of rain tapping on the tin roof. She told her about dreams she had never spoken aloud to anyone, about the little house she hoped to buy one day, with a garden big enough for vegetables and flowers, about the rocking chair she would sit in while the baby slept in her arms, about the life they would build together, just the two of them, quiet and safe and full of love. Sometimes Margaret cried while she talked, not from sadness, but from something deeper, a kind of overwhelming gratitude that she couldn't quite put into words. She had waited so long for this. She had given up so many times, and now here she was, 41 years old, with a miracle growing inside her, and a heart so full it felt like it might burst. She didn't know what was coming. She didn't know how quickly peace could shatter. She only knew that in those warm, golden days before everything changed, she was happy. Truly, deeply, quietly happy. And she would carry that happiness with her, like a lantern in the dark, for the rest of her life. Margaret had waited her whole life for this child. She had dreamed of motherhood since she was a little girl, playing house with rag dolls on the creaky porch of her childhood home. She would wrap them in dish towels and rock them in her arms, singing lullabies her mother had taught her, imagining the day when she would hold a real baby, her own baby, and feel that love everyone talked about, but no one could quite explain. But the years passed, and that dream never came true. She married young, too young, people said, to a man named Robert who worked at the lumber mill outside of town. He was handsome and charming and made her laugh, and for a few years life felt like it was finally falling into place. They rented a small apartment above the hardware store. They talked about saving up for a house. They talked about children, 2, maybe 3, with names they whispered to each other in the dark. But the children never came. Month after month, year after year, Margaret waited and hoped and prayed. She visited doctors who shook their heads and used words she didn't understand. She lit candles at church and knelt on the hard wooden floor until her knees ached. She watched her friends have babies, 1, then 2, then 3, and smiled at their christenings while something inside her quietly broke. Robert grew distant. He stopped talking about the future. He started coming home late, smelling of whiskey and silence. And one winter morning, when the frost still clung to the window panes, he packed a bag and walked out the door without saying goodbye. Margaret never saw him again. She was 34 years old, alone, and certain that the dream she had carried since childhood was gone forever. So she stopped hoping. She poured herself into work instead. She took the job at the Wisteria Inn and found comfort in the rhythm of simple tasks. She made peace with her life, or tried to. She told herself that some women weren't meant to be mothers. She told herself that maybe God had a different plan for her. She told herself that contentment was enough, even if it wasn't the same as joy. And then, 7 months ago, everything changed. It started with small things, fatigue that wouldn't go away, a strange tenderness in her body, a feeling she couldn't name, something deep and quiet and almost forgotten. She ignored it at first. She was 41 years old. Things like this didn't happen to women like her. But the feeling persisted. She drove to the free clinic on a rainy Thursday afternoon, expecting nothing. She sat in the waiting room with her hands folded in her lap, staring at a poster about flu vaccinations. She barely listened when the nurse called her name. She barely breathed when the doctor came in and sat down across from her. And then he said the words, "Mrs. Hollis, you're pregnant." Margaret didn't speak. She couldn't. She just sat there, frozen, her hands gripping the edge of the examination table, her heart pounding so loud she was sure the whole room could hear it. "Are you sure?" she finally whispered. The doctor smiled gently. "I'm sure." She cried for an hour. She cried in the clinic, in her car, on the drive home. She cried standing in her kitchen, staring at the wildflowers on the windowsill. She cried sitting in the rocking chair that night, her hands pressed against her still flat belly, trying to comprehend the miracle that was growing inside her. She named the baby that very night, Hope, because that's what this child was. Hope returned, hope restored, hope given flesh and bone, and a heartbeat she would soon hear on a tiny monitor in a small examination room. From that moment on, Margaret devoted herself entirely to her unborn daughter. She saved every penny she could spare. She bought a second-hand crib from a yard sale and sanded it smooth with her own hands. She found a soft yellow blanket at the thrift store and washed it 3 times to make it perfect. She read aloud every night, children's books, poetry, even recipes, just so her baby would know her voice. She talked to Hope constantly while she folded towels, while she swept floors, while she lay in bed at night, watching the moonlight move across the ceiling. "You are my miracle," she whispered. "You are everything I ever wanted, and I promise you, I promise, I will give you the best life I can." It was a promise she meant with every fiber of her being, a promise she would fight to keep. It was a Tuesday afternoon when Margaret first felt something was wrong. The day had started like any other. She woke before dawn, lying still in the soft gray light, her hands resting gently on the swell of her belly. She waited for the familiar greeting, that little nudge, that tiny roll, that sweet reassurance that Hope was awake and well and ready for another day. It always came. Every morning without fail her daughter stirred beneath her palms like a flower turning toward the sun. But that morning there was nothing. Margaret kept her hands there, pressing lightly, waiting. She counted the seconds in her head. 10, 20, 30. She shifted onto her left side, the way the book said to do, and tried again. Still nothing. Just the quiet rhythm of her own heartbeat echoing through the silence. She told herself not to worry. Babies rest, babies sleep. The pamphlets at the clinic said so, the nurses said so. There were days when movement slowed down, especially in the later weeks, when there was less room to stretch and kick. It didn't mean anything was wrong. It didn't mean anything at all. Margaret got out of bed slowly, her body heavy and tired. She walked to the kitchen and poured herself a glass of cold water. Another trick she had read about. Cold water sometimes woke babies up. She drank the whole glass, standing by the sink, her eyes fixed on the window, her breath shallow and uneven. She waited. Nothing. She pressed her hands to her belly again, harder this time, almost pleading. "Come on, sweet girl," she whispered. "Give Mama a little kick, just one, just so I know you're okay." The seconds stretched into minutes. The minutes stretched into something heavier. Margaret stood there in her small kitchen, the morning light creeping through the yellow curtains, the birds singing outside like the world hadn't changed at all. And she felt the first cold tendril of fear wrap itself around her heart. But then, just as the fear began to take hold, she felt it, a flutter, faint, barely there. Like the brush of a butterfly's wing against her skin, Margaret exhaled so hard her knees almost buckled. She gripped the edge of the counter and closed her eyes, letting the relief wash over her in waves. Tears pricked at her lashes, but she blinked them away. She laughed, a short, breathless sound, and pressed her palm flat against her belly. "There you are," she whispered. "There's my girl." She told herself it was nothing, a fluke. A quiet morning. Babies had quiet mornings. It didn't mean anything, but something had shifted. Something small, something she couldn't name, a feeling that lingered at the edges of her thoughts like a shadow she couldn't quite see. She went through the rest of her day trying to ignore it, folding towels at the inn, arranging flowers in the guest rooms, smiling at Mrs. Bellamy when she asked how she was feeling. But the feeling stayed with her. It followed her through the hallways. It sat beside her on the drive home. It whispered to her in the quiet of her kitchen as she fixed her dinner. That night, Margaret sat in the rocking chair longer than usual. She read aloud from the children's book she had bought at the thrift store, a story about a rabbit who gets lost in the woods and finds his way home. Her voice was soft and steady, but her hands trembled slightly as she turned the pages. She paused between sentences, waiting for movement, hoping for reassurance. It came, eventually. A small kick here, a faint roll there, enough to quiet the fear, but not enough to erase it. Margaret closed the book and set it on the table beside her. She placed both hands on her belly and stared at the window, where the moonlight spilled silver across the floor. "You're okay," she said quietly. "We're both okay. Everything is fine." She said it like a prayer, like a promise, like a spell she was trying to cast over her own heart. But deep inside, in that place where mothers know things they cannot explain, Margaret felt a crack forming, a tiny fracture in the peace she had built so carefully around herself. A whisper that something she couldn't see, couldn't name, couldn't stop, was beginning to go wrong. She pushed the thought away. She told herself she was being foolish. She told herself that by morning everything would be back to normal. But as she lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, her hand still pressed to her belly, the silence felt heavier than it ever had before. The following week, the bed and breakfast closed for the season. Mrs. Bellamy delivered the news on a Friday afternoon, her voice soft and apologetic. The tourists had stopped coming. The rooms sat empty. There simply wasn't enough money to keep the doors open through the winter months. She promised Margaret she would call as soon as things picked up again, maybe in the spring, maybe sooner. But for now, there was nothing more she could do. Margaret smiled and nodded and thanked her for everything. She walked home slowly that evening, her feet heavy on the dusty road, her mind spinning with numbers she couldn't make add up. Rent was due in 2 weeks. The electricity bill sat unopened on her kitchen table. She had $47 in her purse and a jar of coins on her dresser that might hold another 20 if she was lucky. It wasn't enough. It wasn't nearly enough. She called the free clinic the next morning, hoping to schedule a checkup. The baby had been quieter lately, not silent, but quieter, and the worry that had taken root in her chest had begun to grow. But the woman on the phone told her the earliest available appointment was 3 weeks away. 3 weeks. Margaret gripped the phone so tightly her knuckles turned white. "Please," she said. "I'm worried about my baby. She's not moving as much as she used to. Isn't there anything sooner?" The woman sighed. "I'm sorry, ma'am. We're fully booked. 3 weeks is the best I can do." Margaret hung up and sat very still at her kitchen table. The morning light poured through the window, warm and golden, but she didn't feel it. She felt cold. She felt alone. She felt the walls of her small cottage pressing in around her like a fist, slowly closing. She tried the hospital next. She found the number in an old phone book and dialed with trembling fingers. A receptionist answered on the 3rd ring. A brisk, efficient voice that made Margaret feel small before she even spoke. "I'd like to schedule an appointment," Margaret said. "I'm pregnant, 35 weeks. I'm having some concerns." "Do you have insurance?" The question landed like a stone in still water. Margaret closed her eyes. "No," she said quietly. "I don't." There was a pause. A long, heavy pause. "Without insurance, you'll need to pay up front," the receptionist said. "A prenatal exam runs about $300. If you need additional tests, it could be more." $300. Margaret thanked her and hung up. She stared at the phone for a long time, her hand still resting on the receiver, her heart sinking deeper and deeper into her chest. That night she skipped dinner. She told herself she wasn't hungry, but the truth was simpler and more painful. She needed to save every dollar she could. The baby needed prenatal vitamins. The baby needed to come first. So Margaret made herself a cup of tea and sat in the rocking chair, sipping slowly, pretending the warmth in her stomach was enough. The days that followed blurred together in a haze of worry and quiet desperation. She walked to the grocery store and bought only the cheapest things: bread, peanut butter, a carton of milk. She counted every coin. She stretched every meal. She applied for jobs at the diner, the laundromat, the gas station on the edge of town, but no one wanted to hire a woman who was 8 months pregnant and might go into labor at any moment. The baby moved less and less. Some days Margaret felt only one or two faint flutters. Other days she felt nothing at all until late in the evening, when a single weak kick would send a wave of relief crashing over her, followed immediately by a fresh wave of fear. She stopped sleeping through the night. She lay awake for hours, her hands pressed to her belly, counting movements, praying for signs of life. The silence terrified her. The stillness haunted her. She began talking to Hope constantly, desperately, as if her voice alone could keep her daughters safe. Then the notice came. She found it slipped under her front door on a gray Tuesday morning. A single sheet of paper with cold, official words. Rent overdue. Payment required within 10 days. Sincerely, Management. Margaret stood in her doorway, holding the paper in her trembling hands, and felt the last piece of her fragile world begin to crack. She had nothing left. No job, no savings, no insurance, no help. Just herself, tired, scared, and more alone than she had ever been, and a baby who was slipping further away with every passing day. It happened on a Thursday night. Margaret was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, when the first pain hit. It came without warning, a sharp, sudden cramp that tore through her lower belly like a bolt of lightning. She gasped and curled onto her side, her hands flying to her stomach, her breath catching in her throat. For a moment, she couldn't move. She just lay there, trembling, waiting for the pain to pass. It did, slowly, reluctantly. But before she could catch her breath, another wave rolled through her, stronger this time, deeper. Something was wrong. She knew it now. She couldn't pretend anymore. She couldn't tell herself it was nothing. The fear she had been pushing down for weeks rose up inside her like floodwater, filling her chest, her throat, her eyes. She managed to get out of bed. She managed to pull on her shoes and grab her purse. She managed to walk, slowly, painfully, out the front door and down the dark street toward Ruth's house, stopping every few steps to lean against a fence post or a mailbox, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The night air was thick and warm. Crickets sang in the tall grass. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. Margaret kept walking, one step, then another, then another. She focused on the lights glowing in Ruth's window, using them as a beacon, a promise, a prayer. Ruth answered the door in her bathrobe, took one look at Margaret's pale face, and grabbed her car keys without a word. The drive to the hospital felt like a lifetime. Margaret sat in the passenger seat with her eyes closed, her hands pressed against her belly, her lips moving in silent prayer. She thought about Hope. She thought about the tiny yellow blanket folded in the crib. She thought about all the stories she had told her daughter, all the promises she had made, all the dreams she had dared to dream. Please, she prayed. Please let her be okay. Please. When they arrived at the hospital, the emergency room was bright and loud and overwhelming. People sat in plastic chairs along the walls, coughing, crying, waiting. A television mounted in the corner played a late-night talk show that no one was watching. The air smelled like antiseptic and coffee and something else Margaret couldn't name. Ruth helped her to the front desk, where a woman with tired eyes asked for her name, her date of birth, her insurance information. Margaret answered as best she could, her voice shaking, her hands gripping the edge of the counter for support. "I don't have insurance," she said. "But please, I'm bleeding. My baby isn't moving. I need help." The woman typed something into her computer. She didn't look up. "Have a seat. Someone will be with you shortly." Margaret sat, and she waited. An hour passed, then another. The cramps came and went in waves. The fear grew louder with every passing minute. Margaret watched nurses walk by without glancing her way. She watched doctors disappear behind doors marked "Authorized Personnel Only." She watched other patients with insurance cards and calm voices and clean, pressed clothes, get called back one by one. No one called her name. She was about to get up, about to beg someone, anyone, for help, when she heard it. A voice, low and sharp, coming from the nurse's station just a few feet away. "Dr. Harlan won't see her." Margaret froze. She turned her head slowly, carefully, and saw two nurses standing behind the counter. One was young, with dark hair pulled back in a ponytail. The other was older, heavier, with a clipboard pressed against her chest. "Why not?" the younger one asked. The older nurse shrugged. "No insurance, no money. He said she's not worth the liability." Not worth the liability. The words hit Margaret like a slap. She sat very still, her hands trembling in her lap, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her teeth. She looked up and saw him, Dr. Harlan, standing at the far end of the station, signing papers, checking his watch, straightening his white coat. He never once looked her way. In that moment, something inside Margaret shifted. The fear didn't disappear. It was still there, cold and heavy in her chest. But now it was joined by something else, something sharper, something hotter. She understood now. It wasn't about beds. It wasn't about timing. It wasn't about medical protocols or staff shortages or any of the excuses she had imagined. It was about money. It was about worth. It was about who mattered and who didn't. And in this cold, sterile room, Margaret had been judged and found wanting. They moved her to a hallway, not a room, not a bed with curtains and monitors and a nurse who checked on her every few minutes. Just a hallway. A long, narrow corridor with fluorescent lights buzzing overhead and the faint smell of bleach clinging to the air. A young orderly wheeled her there without explanation. He parked the wheelchair against the wall, mumbled something about someone coming to check on her soon, and disappeared around the corner. Margaret watched him go. She didn't call after him. She didn't ask questions. She just sat there, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on the scuffed linoleum floor. The lights above her flickered, once, twice, then steadied again. She was alone, completely, utterly alone. The hallway stretched out in both directions, empty, silent, indifferent. Somewhere in the distance she could hear the muffled sounds of the hospital, voices murmuring, machines beeping, footsteps echoing on hard floors. But none of it reached her. None of it touched her. She was in a bubble of silence, a pocket of stillness, a place where time seemed to have stopped. Margaret lifted her head and stared at the ceiling. She counted the tiles, 1, 2, 3, 4. She counted them because it was easier than thinking, easier than feeling, easier than acknowledging the cold, heavy weight pressing down on her chest. But the thoughts came anyway. They crept in slowly, like shadows lengthening at dusk. She thought about her mother, a quiet woman with calloused hands who had died too young, before Margaret could tell her all the things she needed to say. She thought about Robert, the man who had promised her forever, and then walked away without looking back. She thought about all the jobs she had worked, all the sacrifices she had made, all the years she had spent building a life out of scraps and hope and sheer stubborn will. And for what? For this? To be left in a hallway like a piece of forgotten furniture? To be judged unworthy of care because her pockets were empty? To watch her baby slip away while doctors signed paperwork and nurses whispered behind counters? A tear slid down Margaret's cheek. She didn't wipe it away. She let it fall, down her jaw, down her neck, disappearing into the collar of her worn cotton dress. Another followed, then another. They came silently, steadily, like rain falling on a window. No one was watching. She thought about hope. She thought about the night she had chosen that name, sitting in the rocking chair, her hands pressed to her belly, her heart so full of wonder she could barely breathe. She had believed, truly believed, that this baby was a gift, a second chance, a sign that the universe hadn't forgotten her after all. But maybe she had been foolish. Maybe some people weren't meant to have happy endings. Maybe some people were destined to reach for beautiful things and watch them crumble to dust in their hands. Maybe hope, Real hope, the kind that changes your life, was a luxury she had never been entitled to. Margaret lowered her head. She placed both hands on her belly, gently, tenderly, the way she had done 1,000 times before. But this time, there was no flutter, no kick, no reassurance, just stillness, just silence, just the terrible, aching absence of movement. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Her voice cracked on the words. She pressed her palms harder against her stomach, as if she could reach through skin and muscle and bone to touch her daughter directly. "I'm sorry, baby. I tried. I tried so hard." The tears came faster now. Her shoulders shook. Her breath hitched. She bent forward in the wheelchair, her forehead nearly touching her knees, and let the grief pour out of her in waves. She had never felt so small. She had never felt so invisible. She had spent her whole life being strong, pushing through pain, swallowing disappointment, smiling when she wanted to scream. But here in this empty hallway, with the lights buzzing above her and the silence pressing in from all sides, she had nothing left. No strength, no hope, no fight. Just the raw, unbearable weight of a heart breaking in slow motion. She stayed like that for a long time, bent and broken, crying quietly into the stillness. The hospital moved on around her. Doctors came and went. Patients were wheeled past. Life continued, indifferent and relentless. And Margaret sat alone, invisible, forgotten, holding on to the only thing she had left. Her baby, her dream, her last reason to breathe. Margaret didn't know how long she stayed like that. Minutes, maybe longer. Time had lost all meaning in that cold, empty hallway. She existed in a fog of grief and exhaustion, her body folded in on itself, her tears soaking into the worn fabric of her dress. The world moved on around her, footsteps echoing, machines humming, voices murmuring in distant rooms. But none of it reached her. She was drowning in silence, sinking deeper and deeper into the darkness. But then something shifted. It started small, a flicker of warmth at the edge of her awareness, a feeling she couldn't name. She lifted her head slowly, her vision blurred with tears, and saw something she hadn't noticed before. A young nurse standing at the far end of the hallway. She was young, maybe 25, with soft brown hair pulled back in a low ponytail and kind eyes that seemed to carry a sadness of their own. She wore pale blue scrubs and held a clipboard against her chest, but she wasn't writing on it. She wasn't walking past. She was just standing there, watching Margaret with an expression that held something Margaret hadn't seen in hours. Compassion. Their eyes met. The nurse didn't look away. She didn't pretend she hadn't seen. She held Margaret's gaze across that long, empty corridor, and in that single moment, something passed between them. An acknowledgement, a recognition, a silent message that said, "I see you, I see what's happening, and I'm sorry." Margaret stared back at her, and somewhere deep inside, beneath the grief, beneath the exhaustion, beneath the crushing weight of despair, something stirred. It was faint at first, barely there, like a single ember glowing in a pile of cold ashes. But it was real, it was alive. And with every passing second, it grew a little brighter. Margaret wiped her face with the back of her hand. She sat up straighter in the wheelchair. Her spine ached, her body trembled. But she forced herself upright anyway, forced herself to breathe, forced herself to feel the solid weight of her own hands resting on her belly. Hope was still in there. Her baby was still in there. And as long as that was true, as long as there was even the smallest chance, Margaret couldn't give up. She wouldn't give up. She had fought too hard, waited too long, dreamed too deeply to let it end like this. In a hallway, alone, invisible, no. The word rose up inside her like a wave, quiet at first, then louder, stronger. No, she wasn't going to sit here and wait for someone to save her. She wasn't going to accept this. She wasn't going to let her daughter's life be measured in dollars and insurance policies and cold clinical calculations of worth. She was going to fight. She didn't know how yet. She didn't have a plan. She didn't have money or connections or power. All she had was herself, tired, scared, broken, and a love so fierce it burned like fire in her chest. But maybe that was enough. Maybe that was all she needed. Margaret placed her hands flat on the armrests of the wheelchair. She took a deep breath, slow, steady, deliberate, and felt the air fill her lungs. She exhaled. She breathed again. And with each breath, she felt something returning, something she had lost somewhere in the long, dark hours of waiting. Resolve. Not the loud, angry kind, not the kind that screamed and demanded and made threats. This was quieter, calmer, deeper. It was the resolve of a woman who had nothing left to lose and everything in the world to protect. The resolve of a mother. She looked down at her belly. "I'm not giving up on you," she whispered. "Do you hear me, baby? I'm not giving up. We're going to get through this, together." The words hung in the air like a promise, like a prayer, like the first fragile notes of a song she had almost forgotten how to sing. Margaret looked up again. The young nurse was still there, still watching, still waiting. Their eyes met once more, and this time Margaret didn't look away. She held the gaze. She let the nurse see the change that was happening inside her, the shift from despair to determination, from victim to fighter. The nurse gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, and Margaret nodded back. She didn't know what came next. She didn't know if she would succeed or fail, if anyone would listen, if her voice would matter at all. But she knew one thing for certain. She was done being invisible. Margaret gripped the armrests of the wheelchair and pushed herself to her feet. Her legs trembled beneath her. Her body ached in ways she couldn't describe, a deep, bone-heavy exhaustion that made every movement feel like wading through water. But she stood anyway. She stood because sitting was no longer an option. She stood because her daughter needed her to stand. The hallway stretched out before her, long and sterile and impossibly bright. At the far end, she could see the entrance to the waiting room, the double doors that separated the forgotten from the seen. Beyond those doors were people, witnesses, voices. Margaret began to walk. Each step was a battle. Her swollen feet ached against the cold linoleum. Her lower back throbbed with every movement. The cramps hadn't stopped. They came in waves, tightening around her belly like a fist, then slowly releasing. But she kept moving, one foot in front of the other, slow, steady, deliberate. The young nurse appeared at her side. "Ma'am," she said softly, her voice filled with concern. "Ma'am, you should sit down. You shouldn't be walking." Margaret didn't stop. She didn't even turn her head. "I've been sitting," she said quietly. "I've been sitting for hours, and no one came." The nurse fell silent. She didn't try to stop her. She just walked alongside her, matching her pace, her footsteps soft and uncertain on the hard floor. They reached the double doors. Margaret paused. She placed one hand on the cool metal surface and took a breath. Through the small rectangular window, she could see the waiting room, the rows of plastic chairs, the flickering television, the families huddled together in worry and fear. It was fuller now than it had been before. More people, more faces, more eyes. She pushed the door open. The waiting room fell quiet. Not all at once. It happened in waves, like ripples, spreading across still water. First, the people nearest the door stopped talking, then the ones behind them, then the ones along the far wall. Heads turned. Conversations faded. The television droned on in the corner, but no one was listening anymore. They were all looking at her. Margaret stood in the doorway, one hand pressed against the frame for support, her worn dress damp with sweat, her face pale and drawn. She looked like a ghost, like something fragile and broken that had wandered in from a place no one wanted to see. But her eyes were steady. She scanned the room slowly, taking in the faces. The elderly couple holding hands in the corner, the young mother bouncing a fussy baby on her knee, the teenage boy with a bandaged arm scrolling through his phone. They stared back at her with expressions of confusion, curiosity, concern. Then her gaze found the nurse's station. Dr. Harlan was still there. He stood behind the counter, a chart open in his hands, a pen tucked behind his ear. He hadn't noticed her yet. He was talking to another doctor. Something about a golf game, a weekend trip, a restaurant he wanted to try. His voice was light, casual, utterly indifferent to the world around him. Margaret began walking again. The crowd parted slightly as she moved. People shifted in their seats, pulled their bags closer, made room for her without being asked. The young nurse followed a few steps behind. Her clipboard clutched to her chest, her eyes wide and uncertain. The air in the room grew heavy, thick, charged with something electric. An anticipation that hummed just beneath the surface, waiting to break free. Margaret's footsteps echoed on the tile floor. One step, then another, then another. Dr. Harlan looked up. His expression shifted. First confusion, then recognition, then something harder, something colder. He set the chart down on the counter and straightened his white coat, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. "Ma'am," he said, his voice clipped and professional. "You need to return to your seat. Someone will call you when—" "No?" The word came out stronger than Margaret expected. It cut through the air like a blade, sharp and clear and unwavering. Dr. Harlan blinked. The room held its breath. Margaret stopped walking. She stood just a few feet from the counter, her hands at her sides, her chest rising and falling with each labored breath. She could feel every eye in the room on her, watching, waiting, wondering what would happen next. She didn't know exactly what she was going to say, but she knew she was done being silent. She was done being invisible, and whatever came next, she would face it standing. The silence in the waiting room was absolute. It pressed against the walls, filled the corners, wrapped around every person like a held breath. The television in the corner flickered silently. Someone had muted it without anyone noticing. Even the baby in the young mother's arms had stopped fussing, as if sensing that something important was about to happen. Margaret stood before the nurse's station, her body swaying slightly, her hands trembling at her sides. She could feel the weight of every gaze in the room, curious, concerned, uncertain. But she didn't look at them. She kept her eyes fixed on the man in front of her, Dr. Harlan. He stood behind the counter with his arms crossed over his chest, his expression a carefully composed mask of professional detachment. But Margaret could see the tension in his jaw, the flicker of irritation in his eyes, the way his fingers tapped impatiently against his forearm. He didn't see her as a person. He saw her as a problem. "Ma'am," he said again, his voice tight and controlled, "I'm going to have to ask you to return to your seat. You're disrupting the—" "You looked at me." Margaret's voice was quiet, calm, steady. It didn't rise or waver. It simply existed, clear and true and impossible to ignore. Dr. Harlan stopped talking. Margaret took a slow breath. She felt the pain in her belly, the exhaustion in her bones, the fear that still coiled around her heart like a vine. But she also felt something else, something stronger, resolve. "You looked at me," she repeated, "when I came in tonight, when I told the woman at the desk that I was bleeding, when I begged for someone to help me. You looked right at me." She paused. The room remained frozen. "And then you looked away." Dr. Harlan's expression flickered just for a moment, before settling back into its careful mask. "I don't know what you think you heard, but I can assure you, you said I wasn't worth the liability." The words landed like stones dropped into still water. Ripples of shock spread through the waiting room, whispers, gasps, the soft rustle of people shifting in their seats. Dr. Harlan's face went pale. "That's not—" he started. "I heard you." Margaret's voice remained steady, but there was an edge to it now, a sharpness that hadn't been there before. "I was sitting right there, 10 feet away, bleeding, scared, praying that someone, anyone, would help me. And I heard you tell that nurse that I wasn't worth your time." She stepped closer. Her legs shook beneath her, but she didn't stop. "This baby," she said, placing both hands on her belly, "has a heartbeat. She has fingers and toes and a name. I call her Hope. I've been talking to her every night for 7 months. I've been singing to her, reading to her, telling her about the world she's going to see." Her voice cracked, but she pushed through. "And you decided she didn't matter, because I don't have insurance, because I'm poor, because I walked in here with worn-out shoes and no credit card." Tears streamed down her face now, but she didn't wipe them away. She let them fall. "I am her mother, and I am asking you and begging you to help me save her life." The room was utterly still. No one moved. No one spoke. The weight of Margaret's words hung in the air, pressing down on everyone who heard them. Dr. Harlan opened his mouth to respond, but before he could speak, another voice cut through the silence. "Dr. Harlan." It was calm, measured, and it came from the corner of the room. Everyone turned. An older woman rose from one of the plastic chairs near the window. She was perhaps 60, with silver hair pinned back in an elegant twist and sharp, intelligent eyes that missed nothing. She wore a simple gray coat, unremarkable at first glance, but as she stepped forward, she unbuttoned it slowly, deliberately. Beneath the coat was a hospital badge, a board member's badge. "My name is Eleanor Whitmore," the woman said quietly. "I sit on the governing board of this hospital, and I believe you and I need to have a conversation." The color drained from Dr. Harlan's face. Eleanor turned to Margaret, her expression softening. "Come with me, dear," she said gently. "We're going to take care of you now." And for the first time in hours, Margaret allowed herself to breathe. Everything moved quickly after that. Eleanor Whitmore placed a gentle hand on Margaret's back and guided her through a set of double doors that had remained closed to her all night. Nurses appeared from nowhere, different nurses with softer voices and kinder eyes. And within minutes, Margaret was lying in a real bed, in a real room, with monitors beeping steadily beside her, and warm blankets draped over her trembling body. A doctor arrived. Not Dr. Harlan, a woman this time, with graying hair and gentle hands and a calm, reassuring presence that made Margaret want to weep with relief. She introduced herself as Dr. Amelia Chen, the head of obstetrics, and she didn't waste a single moment. "Let's take a look at your baby," she said softly, squeezing Margaret's hand. The ultrasound wand pressed against Margaret's belly. The room fell silent. Margaret held her breath, her fingers gripping the thin hospital sheet, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. And then, a sound, a heartbeat, faint, rapid, fluttering like the wings of a tiny bird. Margaret gasped. Her hand flew to her mouth. Tears spilled down her cheeks. Not tears of grief this time, but something else entirely. Something bright and overwhelming and too big to contain. "There she is," Dr. Chen said, smiling gently. "Your baby's heartbeat is strong, but she's in some distress. We're going to need to deliver her tonight." Margaret nodded. She couldn't speak. She could only lie there listening to that miraculous sound, the proof that hope was still alive, still fighting, still waiting to meet her mother. The surgery happened within the hour. Margaret remembered fragments, the bright lights of the operating room, the soft voices of the surgical team, the pressure and pulling that felt strange but never painful. She remembered staring at the ceiling, whispering prayers under her breath, counting the seconds until she heard the one sound she had been waiting her entire life to hear. A cry. Small, thin, perfect. Margaret's heart stopped, then started again, beating faster than it ever had before. "It's a girl," someone said. And then they placed her on Margaret's chest, a tiny, wrinkled, red-faced miracle wrapped in a white blanket. And the whole world fell away. Margaret looked down at her daughter. She was so small, so fragile. Her eyes were squeezed shut, her tiny fists curled against her cheeks, her mouth open in a soft, bewildered cry. She weighed almost nothing, barely 5 pounds, but to Margaret, she was the heaviest, most precious thing she had ever held. "Hello, Hope," Margaret whispered. The baby's cries softened. Her tiny body relaxed against her mother's chest, as if she recognized the voice she had been listening to for 7 months, as if she knew, even now, that she was safe. Margaret closed her eyes and let the tears come. They stayed like that for a long time, mother and daughter, skin to skin, heartbeat to heartbeat, while the world outside continued to turn. Later, Eleanor Whitmore came to visit. She sat in the chair beside Margaret's bed, her hands folded in her lap, her expression soft and thoughtful. She didn't speak right away. She just looked at the baby sleeping in Margaret's arms, and something in her eyes seemed to drift far away. "I lost a daughter," she said quietly, "a long time ago. She was born in a hospital like this one, a hospital that turned her father and me away because we didn't have the right paperwork, the right connections." She paused. Her voice trembled, but she steadied it. "She didn't survive." Margaret's heart ached. She looked at Eleanor, this elegant, composed woman who had appeared out of nowhere and changed everything, and saw, for the first time, the grief she carried beneath the surface. "I've spent the last 30 years trying to make sure it never happens to anyone else," Eleanor continued, "and tonight I almost failed again." She reached out and touched Margaret's hand. "But you didn't let me. You stood up. You spoke. You refused to be invisible." Margaret shook her head. "I didn't do anything special. You did everything," Eleanor said firmly. "And I promise you, Dr. Harlan will answer for what he did. This hospital will change because of you." Margaret looked down at her daughter, at Hope, sleeping peacefully in her arms, and felt something settle deep inside her chest. Peace. Real peace. The kind she hadn't felt in a very long time. She was no longer invisible. She was a mother, and she was home. 2 weeks later, Margaret brought Hope home. The cottage looked different now, not because anything had changed, but because everything had changed. The yellow curtains still hung in the kitchen window. The ceramic vase still held wildflowers on the sill. The old rocking chair still sat in the corner of the bedroom waiting. But the rooms felt fuller somehow, warmer, alive in a way they had never been before. Margaret stood in the doorway for a long moment, holding her daughter against her chest, breathing in the familiar scent of home. Hope was wrapped in the soft yellow blanket, the one Margaret had bought at the thrift store and washed 3 times to make perfect. She was sleeping, her tiny fingers curled around the edge of the fabric, her breath soft and steady and impossibly sweet. "Welcome home, baby girl," Margaret whispered. She walked slowly through the cottage, showing Hope each room as if she could see it. The kitchen where Margaret would make her breakfast, the bathroom where she would give her baths, the bedroom where they would sleep side by side, where Margaret would sing lullabies and tell stories and watch her daughter grow. She saved the rocking chair for last. Margaret lowered herself into it carefully, adjusting Hope in her arms, and began to rock. The chair creaked softly beneath her, a familiar, comforting sound, and the afternoon light spilled golden through the window, painting the walls in shades of honey and amber. For a long time, she just sat there, rocking, breathing, holding her miracle. She thought about everything that had happened, the fear, the pain, the long, dark hours in that hospital hallway when she had been certain all was lost. She thought about the cruelty she had witnessed, the cold indifference of a man who had looked at her and seen nothing worth saving. She thought about the moment she had stood up, the moment she had refused to be invisible, the moment she had found her voice when it mattered most. And she thought about Eleanor. The older woman had visited her every day in the hospital. She brought flowers and books and soft blankets for the baby. She sat by Margaret's bed and talked. About her own daughter, about the grief she had carried for 30 years, about the changes she was determined to make. She told Margaret that Dr. Harlan had been placed on administrative leave pending a full investigation. She told her that new policies were being drafted, policies that would ensure no one would ever be turned away again. "You did this," Eleanor had said on the last day, squeezing Margaret's hand. "You changed things. Don't ever forget that." Margaret hadn't known what to say. She still didn't. She was just a woman, a poor, tired, ordinary woman who had fought for her daughter the only way she knew how. She hadn't set out to change anything. She had simply refused to give up. But maybe that was enough. Maybe that was everything. She looked down at Hope, sleeping peacefully in her arms, and felt a wave of love so powerful it took her breath away. This tiny girl, this 5-pound miracle, had no idea what her mother had been through. She had no idea how close they had come to losing each other. She only knew warmth, safety, the sound of her mother's heartbeat. And Margaret made a silent promise, right there in that rocking chair, that Hope would always know those things, that she would grow up feeling loved and valued and seen, that she would never, ever feel invisible. "The world isn't always kind," Margaret whispered, stroking her daughter's cheek. "People won't always see your worth, but I want you to remember something, baby girl. You matter. You have always mattered, and no one gets to tell you otherwise." Hope stirred slightly, her tiny lips curving into something that almost looked like a smile. Margaret smiled back. Outside, the birds sang in the oak tree. The afternoon light stretched long and golden across the floor. And in the small, quiet cottage at the edge of Cedarville, a mother and daughter rocked gently together, wrapped in peace, wrapped in hope, wrapped in a love that had survived the darkest night. Sometimes the people the world overlooks are the ones carrying the greatest strength inside them. Sometimes it takes losing everything to find your voice. And sometimes, if you're brave enough to stand up, to speak out, to refuse to be invisible, you can change not just your own life, but the lives of everyone around you. What would you do in this situation? Share your thoughts in the comments.